morning and welcome to the WuXi webinar series on rare diseases. I'm Rich Saul of WuXi AppTec, and I'll serve as your session leader for panel 2, What's Changing in the Huntington's Disease Landscape. Huntington's disease is a genetic and progressive neurodegenerative condition cause problems with a person's ability to think, move, and function. It ultimately leads to increasing disability and loss of independence. This devastating hereditary disease profoundly affects entire families for generations. There's not a cure for Huntington's disease, nor are there approved therapies to treat the underlying cause of disease, this condition. The unmet need is immense. In this section of the webinar, we'll discuss the latest understanding of Huntington's disease from the clinical perspective. We'll hear what it's like to live with Huntington's disease, its tolls and dilemmas from a personal view, and we'll explore the evolving and growing voice of the patient through engagement of patient advocates. And joining me in alphabetical order are Blair Levitt, professor at the Department of Medical Genetics and senior scientist at the Center for Molecular Medicine and Therapeutics at University of British Columbia, Karen E. Anderson, professor of psychiatry and neurology from Georgetown University and director of the Huntington's Disease Care Education Research Center. Kristen Powers is executive producer of the documentary Twitch, and Sven Olaf Olsen is the president of the International Huntington's Association. So I'd like to begin with Blair, and you can provide our listening audience with a overview of where we are today in terms of understanding of Huntington's disease and its diagnosis, as well as intervention.
Thank you, Richard. In Huntington's disease, because this is a monogenic autosomal dominant disorder, it's caused by a single mutation, we have some very real advantages from the point of view of developing therapeutics. We understand the underlying cause, the change in the DNA that is associated with the development of this disorder. And we can determine with a great degree of accuracy who is going to develop this disease, but well before the onset of symptoms. And we have absolute understanding of the individuals who carry this diagnosis. And so that gives us a great advantage in the development of therapeutics over other disorders that are multifactorial in their origin. And there's been a wealth of understanding since the gene changes that cause Huntington's disease were identified in 1993. And in addition to understanding how the gene change leads to changes in the brain and symptoms in Huntington's disease, there's a wealth of preclinical models in which to test therapeutics. So from the point of view of diagnosis, we have an absolutely accurate state biomarker. We understand whether a person carries the gene or not. The diagnosis is based on clinical signs and symptoms that are really made currently based on an exam from a physician. So it's based on the motor manifestations of the disease, although it is a disease that can affect multiple symptoms. It can cause neuropsychiatric manifestations, it can cause cognitive impairment, but really the diagnosis currently is based on the development of the motor symptoms as diagnosed by a physician. So there is evolving efforts to broaden the diagnosis to include other aspects. There's recently been a move to include a period that's generally considered to be prodromal Huntington's disease, where there may be subtle changes that don't quite reach the clinical diagnosis. And that's really critical when we talk about interventions and therapeutics, because we want to be able to intervene as early as possible in the process and actually prevent the onset and prevent that ultimate diagnosis. And there's been a wealth of effort originally from EHDN and HSG and the PHAROS and PREDICT studies. And then following this, some really excellent deep phenotyping through the various TRACK-HD and TRACK-ON studies that are studying this and learning about this prodromal state and how we can measure changes in that period. And I think we are well set up now to bring interventions earlier and earlier in the disease, which I think is increasing our likelihood of finding effective therapy. So I would say that it's a very collaborative and progressive research field, both really across the world now, and have worked well together to work on the details of the diagnosis, understanding the prodromal state, and establishing effective study groups for interventions that hopefully will lead to effective therapies in this disorder.
Thank you very much for that overview. We'll come back and talk about some later around maybe some neuroprotective approaches potentially, and about tackling symptomology or onset before you display symptoms. So Karen, actually, Huntington's disease is far more complex than just this movement disorder and degeneration. What kind of care do Huntington's disease patients need? And are there healthcare providers that are engaged in this process? And maybe you can touch upon genetic testing and in respect to the care dilemmas that people face in that regard.
Sure. So yes, Huntington's, as Blair said, is a very complex disease. We think of it traditionally as a movement disorder with rapid movements called chorea, with fixed posturing in the hands or the trunk or the legs called dystonia, balance problems, swallowing problems. Patients develop difficulty speaking as the disease progresses. So those are sort of the neurological symptoms that patients and families experience. The cognitive symptoms can be just as debilitating. Patients can lose their ability to organize information, to plan things. They may have trouble following through on something with multiple steps. So even something like emptying a dishwasher and knowing where to put the particular dishes, if they get interrupted, it's hard for them to go back. They often lose their ability to multitask. And then in addition to cognitive deficits, they develop behavioral symptoms. And this can be really the range of things that we see in the general population. Certainly depression and anxiety are very common. Sleep disorders are very common. Irritability, suicidal thinking, aggression can all be seen in people with Huntington's. So it's really a wide array of symptoms that we see. Sometimes we see cognitive changes like early trouble with focus and concentration years before someone has any of the movement symptoms. Sometimes there are behavioral symptoms like very bad depression, severe suicidal thinking years before someone has movements. So it can be complex to understand when the disease really starts clinically in an individual. As Blair said, there is testing available. So an advantage that we have in Huntington's compared to other neurodegenerative diseases is we can send a blood test on any individual and know from the result of that test whether or not that individual is going to develop Huntington's at some point. The difficulty is deciding if it's the right time for someone to test or if they want to test. Because knowing that you have the Huntington's gene expansion mutation means at some point you will develop symptoms of the disease. It doesn't tell you exactly when. We're not yet very accurate about predicting for somebody when or what the symptoms will be like or what the exact course of the disease will be like. One of the things about Huntington's is even though it's caused by a single gene mutation, there's a lot of variability in terms of the symptoms that patients have and how the disease progresses. So it's a simple gene test in some ways, but a really complex decision for the individual and their families. People may decide not to be tested. The majority of people who are at risk actually don't get tested. Some of the reasons that they will cite is because there's not a cure. There aren't treatments at this time to slow down the disease. Perhaps it would add to the burden of anxiety and worry that they would, every time they drop something, they think it might be Huntington's. So there are many reasons that people have for not testing. The reasons for testing are to be able to plan for the future, perhaps to plan, family planning, and to know what's in store for them. In terms of care, patients who come to Huntington's disease centers, like the ones that we have in the US through the Huntington's Disease Society of America or the Huntington Society of Canada, and EHDN has a network of centers also, can receive multidisciplinary care. They could have access to a physical therapist, a nutritionist, a genetic counselor, certainly neurologists and psychiatrists, and perhaps a neuropsychologist to help with understanding the memory changes and managing some of the cognitive symptoms.
Thank you very much. Kristen, you created a very powerful documentary, self-documentary, Twitch, and that documented your personal journey in dealing with your mother's Huntington's disease diagnosis, progression, ultimately her passing. It must have been very emotional for you and the family, and maybe you could share with us what some of the key struggles that you and your family dealt with in your personal journey. Maybe you can share that with the audience.
Sure. So again, my name's Kristen. I am the executive producer of Twitch, which was a documentary I made when I was thinking about getting tested in high school. So growing up, I felt like I didn't really have a community that understood what Huntington's disease meant to my family. As I was coming of age, my mom was already in a nursing home, so people couldn't see physically. My friends and their family couldn't see physically what was happening to her. So it did feel very excluded. The Huntington's Disease Youth Organization had not yet been created. Social media was kind of just coming into existence. So it did feel like a pretty isolating experience. And so with Twitch, I wanted to demonstrate to people physically or visually what that experience was like. We did not know my mom was at risk of Huntington's. I don't know my biological grandfather, and he was the one that passed it on. So her mood swings and her depression and irritability were really surprising to us. We didn't know where it was coming from. My dad would often say, when she started showing signs, it wasn't the same person that he had married. Something had shifted. And it wasn't until she really started to show more of the physical symptoms that she ended up getting tested for Huntington's. And so, it's just generally a very difficult experience. And we were kind of fortunate in some ways that she was the only one manifesting symptoms at once. I know many other families who had aunts and uncles, cousins, grandparents, perhaps several people at once experiencing the disease. And so we were a little different because my aunts and uncles were of a different father than my mom. So, but yeah, the testing experience, very emotional. Making the decision to test, very emotional. My family was not always on the same page of whether that was a good idea or not. And so I think that's very similar to other Huntington's families, that testing can be very controversial and very emotional. And so the filming process, I really tried to capture that tension.
Thank you very much. Sven, you're head of the patient advocate group, and maybe you can tell the audience what kind of roles the association's been playing, particularly in this physician-patient relationship and how that's changed over time.
The most important thing when we are talking about Huntington's and what we really have to have in mind, it is that Huntington's, it doesn't know any borders. And this means that the problems you see people have in US are more or less the same as they have in India or in Pakistan or other places on the globe. So first of all, the International Huntington Association is focused, of course, on the patient, but we are a family organization because HD, Huntington disease, it's not only a personal disease. It affects the whole family, and it causes a lot of family problems, which we are focusing on. And of course, as Karen said, it's possible to do something with these problems, which you see during the time you started to become sick. And we try at our best to give advices, whether the person is living in China, in Japan, or in Norway. It doesn't matter. It's more or less the same. The whole family is affected by HD.
And how has patient advocacy evolved over time? And I could start with Sven. Maybe Blair or Karen can chime in too with their thoughts.
Yeah, I certainly find that patients are much more involved in the design of clinical trials now than they were many years ago. I think it used to be that we would get together as a group of investigators and experts and create something and then push it out to the patient population and say, come sign up for our clinical trial. Now, pretty much every steering committee, often even safety committees, will have patient and family representatives so that the patient voice is really heard much more in terms of research development.
Yeah, there has been a huge change in the way the pharma, for instance, are working now. First of all, the pharma, they reach out to the family organizations globally, in fact, and try to learn what is the different problems in the different cultures. And we have, as a family voice, a strong impact on development of drugs. We are always invited to meetings where the scientific world meets. There are also patients' representatives.
Are you going to the regulatory agencies?
Yeah, of course, that's an important work for all the organizations to try to do something towards the EMA, FDA, or other organizations similar to that. So, of course, we have an important job to do to really, as Blair said, we are in a shift now. We understand more or less the way this disease starts, and there is dozens of companies pharma companies focusing on developing drugs. And when these drugs are available, it's our job to do an impact on FDA, EMA, and other organizations like that, of course.
Well, thank you. I have a question for Kristen regarding a relationship or partnership between, let's say, the patient or patient family with physician. Can you comment on that?
Sure. So I think when my mom was experiencing her symptoms, she lived in Massachusetts and then Connecticut. So she had access to some of the best Huntington's disease support teams in I think the world, through Mass General, through UConn, different universities and hospital systems. So I think my grandma was the one who's really the advocate for her, navigating those systems and learning as much as she could. She's not a science person by any means, but she would try to learn from them what she needed to do. She joined Huntington's disease support groups, which are staffed usually by physicians or people who work with Huntington's disease patients. And I participated in those as well as I got older. So I think the intimacy between Huntington's disease communities and their medical providers is pretty tight knit, as long as you're working with someone who knows Huntington's. I've also heard people who live maybe perhaps in more rural communities or communities that aren't proximate to some of the centers of excellence who may not be receiving the same level of care, understanding of the disease in their communities. And then also I think with the testing process, I didn't have a long-term relationship with any of the providers that guided me through the process. I think that is really dependent on the individual sometimes, especially the genetic counseling portion. But I think, getting the input from these professionals and having time for conversation and questions and really them asking me what I was hoping for from the process was important. Again, the input from the families and people directly affected.
Anyone else like to comment at all?
I would just like to add to what everyone has said before, which is, it's really an incredible strength of this community that we really are the scientists, the clinicians, all of the medical teams working on this are very closely integrated with the patient community. We have long-standing relationships, and as Van Olaf and Karen have mentioned, this clearly has evolved to have a very active patient advocacy role in the design of clinical trials, in what are important outcome measures that we look at in our clinical trials. But I would say it goes even much deeper than that, and that the patient advocacy groups are critical both in supporting some of the basic research that has led to these advances and has led to these therapies, and they continue to be involved in supporting the basic research. But the basic researchers, in many cases, will have, at a meeting that may be purely devoted to basic science, will often have patient advocates presenting, especially to the scientists who don't see patients, about the disease. So it is one of the real strengths is how integrated the patient advocacy and the patients and families are with both the basic science and the clinical trials. So we view this as we all have a common goal. We're all working together to develop effective therapies, and importantly, therapies that are beneficial in ways that families need them. And that doesn't necessarily mean pharmacologic agents. Any intervention that helps patients deal with this devastating disease and families deal with this devastating disease is something that we're interested in advancing.
Right. Thank you. And along those lines, Blair, we only have drugs that can address, symptoms today. What have you been what has been your experiences regarding disease-modifying agents and getting those to advance through clinic?
That's a great question, Richard. And I actually take a step back and say, we don't just have symptomatic therapies. A critical message that we need to make more often is that individuals and families who are affected by Huntington's disease need to be seen in proper multidisciplinary centers, because there are therapies that help, there are approaches that help, and we have networks of centers of excellence across the world now. And Sven Olof is instrumental in getting these really truly around the world. But certainly there are therapies, and they're very effective for many of the symptoms, and that's critical. That's really important, and it makes a difference in the life of patients. I have seen it in my lifetime that there have been dramatic improvements in the quality of life that we can provide to individuals affected by this disease. That said, the holy grail for all of us is to identify disease-modifying therapies, and we're at a really incredible time right now. There are a number of very exciting therapeutic approaches going forward. We know that the gene that causes this disease produces an abnormal protein called Huntington is the protein, and a very important approach to therapy is to modulate or lower the levels of that abnormal protein. Unlike many diseases, this is believed to primarily cause disease by a toxic gain of function. So this abnormal protein now has new properties that cause it to injure brain cells. And so a very clear and obvious therapeutic approach is to decrease or lower the amount of that abnormal protein. So what we would call Huntington lowering therapies are already in the clinic and already being tested, and there's a lot of excitement about that. There are other approaches that change how the protein, that change modifications of the protein, or how the gene may change over time. So there's a wealth of therapeutic targets. So that's super exciting. Most recently, there have been two very large trials, one large phase 3 trial and sponsored by Roche, and a smaller phase 1/2A trial from Wave, that have unfortunately stopped the dosing and because of lack of efficacy in both of those trials. So on one hand, we have all of this incredible excitement about targets and therapeutics at these targets moving into the clinic, but we've had a recent bump in the road. So on one hand, we could say, to quote Charles Dickens, it's the worst of times because we've had these 2 negative trials, but it's actually really the best of times because we do have many, many, many therapeutics in development. We have multiple kicks of the can. And those other 2 approaches, while the particular trials that were underway didn't show benefit, those approaches still, there's much more information to be gained. We learn from every one of these studies. They were well done studies that are going to give us information. And scientific medicine is empiric. We learn from it, when it's done right, we learn from each of these trials, and we are getting closer and closer. And while this has been a setback, a bump in the road, we're still very optimistic that we're on the right road. And we are going to work together with the patient organizations and with our families, and we are going to reach the end of that road, which will be effective therapies.
Sven, how did the community take the recent setbacks?
As you know, this disease, it is in my wife's family. So when I met my wife 35 years ago, then when we talked about Huntington's, then we were talking about a hope. And the most important word for us when we were really down, it was the word hope. There is a huge change now in the community because the hope has been going from being something you wish that should come, and now it is much more an expectation. So there is an expectation, there is a strong belief in Blair and his research fellows that our expectation, it is that they will find this cure. They will find something that will stop the development of the disease. So this is not longer a hope, but it is an expectation. And when you expect something, if you wish something for Christmas and you don't get it, the setback is really hard to tackle. If you have a hope, then okay, this time I didn't succeed, but and you can live with that. But what we saw during these 2 trials which failed, it was that the community, they really were hurt by this setback. But after a while, Roche did a lot to meet the patient and the families and the organizations. We can see that the belief in the future, it is as strong as it was before we had this setback, because we understand that this was necessary, as Blair said, this was necessary to take the next step, because we have learned so much from what we have done and where we have contributed with 800 people in Roche trial participating. It's amazing. And we recruited that in less than 1 year. It has never, the scientific world has never seen this. So we are really willing to participate, and we are there for the industry again.
Now, Karen, what were your observations? What have you seen since over the last, let's say, couple of months, in light of all the news that have been coming down? How are you best managing the expectations of your patients?
You know, I've shared their sorrow and disappointment. I think we were all really excited about both of these efforts. I've tried very hard to communicate to them that these companies did the right thing, because in research you have to have safety guardrails, and when a study starts to go in the direction of not being safe or not doing what it needs to do, you really do need to stop the study for everyone involved. So I really communicate to them that the studies, looked out for their participants. They made sure that if, when it looked like the study was not helpful, that it was stopped. And I think it's important for people to know that there, as Blair said, there will be many, many more studies. There are so many new agents that are coming. But in order for us to feel safe as clinicians and for patients and families to feel safe to participate, we have to understand that there is a safety system and it works really well when it needs to.
Kristen, I don't know if you want to add any more into this discussion?
Most folks here have kind of shared the general sentiment. For me, I did undergraduate research with Huntingtons, and I kind of have more, I think, realistic expectations of the passing of science research and like the different processes involved. I think I've seen it, with my family who don't understand genetics or the science as much, being very, very hopeful, and and how that changes also decision making. So I think it, like folks have said here, it's really important to be realistic, because I have had families say, well, the science is moving really fast, so there'll be a cure in 5 years, 2 years. And, they were saying that when like 15 years ago. And I was a little more like, I don't think it, I think we still can get therapies really quickly. And I'm optimistic about that, but I'm also not going to, judge or make decisions on my personal life based on a certain timeline of science passing or moving forward. So I think there's just a combination of being realistic and optimistic at the same time, and using that to guide your decision making.
Well, what do you see is some of those clinical development challenges? Are the translational models reliable? Do we have the right biomarkers? Do we have the right ability to assess disease status and functional outcome?
That's another really great question, Richard. And before we leave the conversation on the two recent trials, I would like to say, and I do this, people tend to say they were failed trials. These were not failed trials. A failed trial in clinical development is one that doesn't give an answer. We've learned a lot, and we're going to learn a lot more as we get more and more of the data analyzed from both of these studies. And we've learned from the WAVE study that there wasn't sufficient Huntington lowering in those approaches. And that's important to know. And what we know so far from the Roche is it may have been a different problem. It may have been too much total Huntington lowering, but we're going to learn more. So they were both well done trials, and they're going to give us answers. And that's important. So I have to, in my own mind, remind myself they're not failed studies because they give us information. The drugs at those doses and those forms of administration didn't provide benefit. And there's a big difference there. There have been failed trials in the past that didn't give clear answers. So as we move forward and we think about what are the translational challenges, as I sort of said, we have a wealth of preclinical reagents and tools and systems. We have many, many different animal models, rodents from a variety of different Huntington's mice, rats, we have mini pigs, we have sheep, we have non-human primates. So we have all of the tools. If you ask me what the single thing that we're really missing right now, unfortunately, what we're missing is a gold standard. We don't yet have a single key therapeutic that we know alters the disease in people. And we could then use to back validate each of these approaches. So that is unfortunate, and we all want to change that as soon as possible, but that's where we are currently. So while we have a wealth of preclinical translational development tools, we don't yet know which are better or which are best or which predict benefit, because we don't yet have anything with proven benefit in the patient population. So the way we have to deal with this moving forward is to get as much of that information as possible, to do the best possible preclinical translational work, which is an area where there's a lot of work going on. But I think once we have that first therapy and that first effective therapy and use that as a gold standard, that will make a big difference, and we can then back validate many of our approaches. And I do think ultimately we're going to probably need combination therapies, and we're going to get to a point where oncology is, where we're looking at different regimens and incremental improvements. But we do kind of need that first effective therapy to really start that advancement in a meaningful way, and to better understand where we're having difficulty with our translational models. One thing I would say, and this is maybe a bit complex, but in many of the translational and preclinical models, in order to see phenotypic effects, we are looking at very large changes in the gene. And this is a trinucleotide repeat disorder. And so in order to see and develop models, we amplify it. We have very large repeats, or we have a lot of the protein being expressed. And that may overemphasize that element of pathology, whereas in a human, we have a disease that occurs over decades, and the repeat size in the gene is quite small. There may be other factors that are more important that aren't well modeled in some of the systems that we're looking at. And a recent area where this is of interest is how much role does the absence of the normal gene. So we've talked about this as a gain of function, a toxic gain of function of the abnormal protein, but there is also evidence for a loss of the normal function. And we don't really know to what degree that plays a role in the pathogenesis. And as we are looking at these disease modifying therapies, especially Huntington lowering therapies, that becomes a really critical point to understand. So I think, again, there's an incredible group of people studying this. As Sven has said, this is some of the best brains in the world studying this problem, and it's a great community, and we will get answers. But this is one of the areas where we really don't yet have as much understanding, I think, as we would like. So that would be my long-winded answer to your question.
No, actually, it sets up a question around the question around collaborations, the importance of collaborations, and maybe Karen can address where do you see the biggest gap right now in terms of the collaborative atmospheres between the various stakeholders in your view?
I mean, I think the level of collaboration in Huntington's is just spectacular, especially compared to other disease states. So I think, overall, I think the level of cooperation and collaboration has been terrific. To me, the gap is maybe not so much in collaboration, it's more in reaching patients who aren't at centers of excellence and getting them to participate in clinical trials. Because we don't know as much about those people. We know that people who don't come into clinics are probably a bit different than the ones who do. Their priorities for what should be treated, what symptoms are important may be different. They may have different demographics than the people who end up in clinical trials. So I think, really making an effort to help community physicians, community neurologists, psychiatrists, and families who aren't getting care at a center understand the importance of seeking out specialty care if they can, and being involved in research so that we really have a good understanding of the range of patients in Huntington's.
Thank you. I'm getting a little close to the end, so I'm going to just wrap up with a couple more questions. I'd like to go to Kristen. If you were to film Twitch today, would you do it differently? And how and why?
Yeah, I think the only difference in filming Twitch I would probably do is kind of like a epilogue, so to speak. So, I think when I was receiving genetic counseling and, when I was thinking about testing, people would say, either way, you're going to kind of go through an identity crisis, whether you test positive or negative. And for me, that I understood if I tested positive that could happen, but I didn't really understand what it would look like if I tested negative, which is what I tested. But I think the 6 months, the year after the change in kind of identity, I went from being someone who's always at risk to someone who is, quote unquote, normal, normal count, normal, no longer kind of almost like a different status within the Huntington's disease community. So if I had to do the film again, either way, I probably would want to talk about the longer term experience after the test to show kind of what happens in someone's thought process and experience a few months later.
Sven, are there lessons learned maybe from other advocacy groups that you can bring to bear within the Huntington's disease community, or are you also giving lessons to be learned for those other groups?
I'm not sure if I am. No, this is a question I've now been thinking of, honestly. What I'm thinking of, and what I would like to comment, it is that the focus from the research part, in the way I see it, and I can also see there is a change here. It is that mostly they have been focusing on to stop the disease to develop. So the trials, when we have recruited the patient to the trials, it mostly people being 50, 60 years old, and they have been, they have already developed the disease. What I think will be one of the changes in the future for the researchers, it is to think of preventing the disease to escalate. And the big challenge for the community, for the HD community, it is to motivate young people to participate in trials. Then what I said, it was about the Huntingtonians globally. So this disease, it's not a disease you start to develop on Tuesday and then you become sick on Friday. This starts probably the day you are born. So this is really compared to, for instance, heart diseases and other diseases. The focus in Huntington's, it's a little bit tricky from the family standpoint. But there is one thing I really want to underline. Karen and Blair, they have touched it, and that is the first thing we met as a family organization when Roche said they had to stop the trial. And we got this setback. The first word they said, we will share. We will share with the whole community, the researchers, with you, with everybody, all the results we have gained from this trial. And that is unique. I think it's fantastic. And why do we have it in this way? Because we have had a sponsor, and we have to be so thankful for this sponsor, because his idea, it was, if I'm going to sponsor anything, it's going to be shared and it's going to be open. So the secrets here, of course, there are secrets, but the sharing, the way we are talking to each other, the way we meet each other, it's in a way in the same level, and it's extremely open. I can participate in a scientific conference and sit there, and I could take what I want.
Okay, thank you so
fantastic.
much. Thank you. Blair, I wanted to ask you and Karen, before we get to the end, what kind of technologies are out there, or approaches do you see that can be very useful in, or gets you excited about working in Huntington's? Is it the prospects of going back to treating early, for example, with new approaches, or that would either delay or procrastinate the onset, such that those with Huntington's disease and the mutation could live maybe a better life longer? Things like that, or other kinds of technologies which could directly impact on the disease.
So Richard, I would say that starting earlier is a real advantage, but really what I'm most excited about right now is that not only is there a wealth of different approaches in the clinic and in immediate preclinical space, but we now, because of advances in genome editing, we have the ability to actually target the underlying mutation. So the therapies that are currently being tested are modulating either the protein or the RNA and trying to decrease. But through CRISPR-based or other genome editing technologies, we can now target the DNA. And that's, it doesn't matter what happens after that. We know that that's where the source of this and many genetic disorders. So I'm very excited about the potential that gene editing approaches bring to this and other genetic diseases. I think that is ultimately the approach for the future. These would be curative in that a single, once it's corrected for life, and it can be done early or late. And really the issue there is delivery, and how do we deliver these things to the brain? And there's been some incredible advances with non-viral approaches. There are now nanomedicine approaches that have allowed gene therapies in different organs. It can be applied to the brain. It's actually, some of these approaches are what have very rapidly allowed us to have these new vaccines. So I'm very excited both about non-viral delivery approaches, lipid nanoparticles, for example, and genome editing. And I think we're really on the cusp of some exciting new therapies. And that is on top of all of the very exciting therapies that are already in the clinic. So I'm very optimistic, and I think these technologies are really going to change the world and change medicine.
Thank you. Karen, would you like to add into that?
I absolutely agree. Blair, as you said earlier, I think we're probably headed toward multi-drug therapy, so a cocktail of medications. When you think about what HIV was like many years ago and how people died very quickly, and now with multi-drug regimen, people can live much, much longer lives. I think we're going to be headed in that direction. I think in addition to the technologies that Blair mentioned, certainly the efforts to knock down some of the early inflammatory changes in the brain, some of the monoclonal antibody treatments could be very promising. And those are terrific because they would work across other diseases. So if we really find that we can decrease early inflammatory changes in the brain, if it's beneficial, it could possibly help Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and other neurodegenerative disease also.
No, thank you. We've actually gone over a little bit. So I'd like to have each of you give some thoughts on terms of a wrap up, and what would be your view of the world of Huntington's disease, say 20 years from now? And I'm going to start first with Blair, because I want to end with our patients. I'll go to Blair first and Karen, and then we'll do Kristen, and then we'll end with Olaf. So Blair.
So Richard, my view is that I will no longer, or none of us will be treating Huntington's disease because it will be cured in 40 years. That's the case. It will be, the gene will be corrected early in life. As Sven Olaf said, some of these changes may occur even soon after birth, but we'll have the ability to intervene very rapidly, very early, and prevent the subsequent development of this disease. And we'll all be working on something else, hopefully aging.
Yeah, Karen.
I agree. I think that we'll be maybe identifying some cases of Huntington's here and there, but certainly for families where the mutation is known, we'll have a treatment that really does arrest the disease and possibly even correct it so that it doesn't progress. And I'll be happy to work in another area.
Kristen?
That's awesome to hear that y'all think that, because I wasn't sure how, again, or like earlier, how fast the science will move. But I think living in a world where Huntington's disease is not that death sentence, it's not devastating to families. Families can hear that they come from a Huntington's disease family, and it just means it's part of their genetics, but it doesn't mean that they're financially bankrupt or that go through the trauma of losing multiple family members and growing up at the same time knowing you may have that same fate. So I think it's an opportunity to live a life like everyone else.
Sven, let's end with you and your thoughts.
I'm very optimistic. I share what Karen and Blair says. For sure, there will be a drug which we can start to treat people with in a very maybe days after they are born. HD will probably not be a part of our daily life in the industrial world. However, and this is really something we should think over, it is that maybe it will be a difference if you are born in India, in the street, or you are born in US or in Europe, or you are born in South America. That is the challenge for the world. And that's why we are working so hard to bring the community together. And I'm so glad that you, Richard, have taken the initiative to discuss this HD topic, because what we really need, it is solidarity.
Okay.
It's also in HD and in all other cases, solidarity.
Thank you so much for your closing thoughts, Olaf. And I want to give my personal thanks to Kristen, to Olaf, to Karen, Blair for your participation in today's webinar and expressing your thoughts and sharing your experiences with the community here. So again, thank you so much. And I want to thank our viewing audience for taking the time to participate as well and listen to the rare disease webinar series from WuXi. We look forward to the next one with you. Thank you all.